The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream paper that whispered of old money and older secrets. Inside, my bank statement showed a balance that would make most people dizzy with possibility. But as I stared at those numbers that had once meant freedom, security, a future, I felt only the familiar weight of dread settling in my chest like winter fog over the Teton Range. The digits blurred as tears threatened, but I blinked them away. After all, tears were a luxury I could no longer afford, regardless of what my bank account suggested. The statement trembled in my hands, not from the Wyoming wind that rattled the windows of my downtown Jackson apartment, but from the terrible knowledge of what those numbers really represented. What they had cost me. What they would cost everyone else. My name is Sage Whitmore, and until 6 months ago, I believed I was the luckiest woman in Jackson Hole. I was engaged to Tanner McKenzie, heir to one of Wyoming's oldest ranching dynasties, and I possessed what most people would consider an embarrassment of riches. The kind of wealth that transforms problems into mere inconveniences, that opens doors before you even realize they were closed. But money, I was learning, had its own gravitational pull. It bent reality around itself in ways that weren't always immediately visible. The first sign came when Tanner's family refused to let me into their sprawling ranch house for what was supposed to be our engagement celebration. I stood on the wraparound porch of the McKenzie estate, snow beginning to dust the peaks of the Grand Tetons behind me, while voices carried through the heavy oak door. Tanner's mother, Patricia, spoke in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She's not one of us, Tanner. Look at where she comes from." I pressed my ear closer to the door, my breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. The conversation inside grew more heated, though I could only catch fragments. Something about bloodlines and legacy, about protecting what generations of McKenzies had built. Patricia's voice rose sharply when she mentioned my background, the daughter of a single mother who'd cleaned houses in Teton Village, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after my father disappeared when I was 7. What they didn't know, what I'd never told anyone except Tanner, was that my circumstances had changed dramatically 18 months earlier. A series of investments I'd made almost by accident, cryptocurrency purchased with tip money from my job at the Snake River Lodge, a small pharmaceutical stock I'd bought on a whim, had multiplied beyond my wildest projections. I'd gone from living paycheck to possessing wealth that dwarfed even the McKenzie family fortune. But I'd kept quiet about it. Old habits, perhaps, or maybe some instinct that warned me wealth without the proper pedigree was somehow suspect in Jackson's rarefied social circles. Through the door, I heard Tanner's voice, lower but firm. "She makes me happy, Mom. Isn't that enough?" "Happiness is fleeting," came Patricia's reply. "Legacy is forever." I was about to knock when the door suddenly swung open. Tanner stood there, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Behind him, I could see the family gathered in the great room, Patricia with her steel-gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon, his father Hank with his weathered rancher's hands clasped behind his back, and his sister Autumn, her expression unreadable. "Sage," Tanner said, and something in his voice made my heart skip. "I'm sorry. They need time." "Time for what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To accept you." The words hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Behind him, his family waited, their silence more damning than any words could have been. That night, Tanner came to my apartment with a bottle of wine and an apology that tasted like ash. He sat on my small couch, his tall frame looking incongruous among my thrift store furniture and second-hand books. We'd been together for 2 years, but suddenly I felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time. "They'll come around," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked to the window that overlooked the town square. Jackson in October was tourist-perfect, all golden aspens and distant snow-capped peaks. But beneath the postcard beauty, I could feel the rigid social hierarchies that had governed this place for generations. Old money versus new money, ranching families versus newcomers, those who belonged versus those who merely existed on the periphery. "What if they don't?" I asked. Tanner was quiet for a long moment. "Then, they will. They have to." But I heard the uncertainty threading through his words, and for the first time since we'd gotten engaged, I wondered if love was really enough to bridge the chasm between who I was and who his family thought I should be. The solution came to me 3 days later, while I was reviewing my investment portfolio. My financial advisor, a discreet woman named Claire Hendricks who worked out of a small office above a gallery on Pearl Street, had been pushing me to diversify my holdings. The numbers on her screen were staggering. My net worth had crossed the 8-figure threshold the previous month, pushed higher by a biotech stock that had announced a revolutionary treatment for Alzheimer's disease. You're entering the realm where wealth becomes generational, Claire said, her fingers dancing across her calculator. This kind of money, properly managed, could support dozens of families for centuries. I stared at the figures, feeling that familiar disconnection that came whenever I contemplated my financial situation. It still didn't feel real, this transformation from struggling waitress to accidental millionaire. Sometimes I would wake up expecting to find it had all been an elaborate dream. I want to make a gesture, I said suddenly. Claire raised an eyebrow. What kind of gesture? Something that shows I'm serious about this place. About belonging. That evening, I called Tanner and asked him to set up another meeting with his family. He was hesitant at first, clearly worried about subjecting me to another round of rejection. But something in my voice must have convinced him, because he agreed to arrange dinner at the ranch for the following Sunday. I spent the week preparing, not just mentally but practically. I had Claire prepare a comprehensive financial statement, something that would make my position unmistakably clear. I also researched the McKinsey family's history, their business interests, their charitable foundations. If I was going to be accepted into their world, I needed to understand its contours. The McKinsey ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Wyoming real estate, its main house a testament to a century of careful stewardship and gradual expansion. As I drove up the long gravel driveway on that crisp November evening, I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me. This wasn't just a home, it was a dynasty made manifest in timber and stone. Tanner met me at the door, his expression carefully neutral. They've agreed to hear you out, he said. But Sage, be prepared for anything. The family was assembled in the dining room, seated around a table that could have accommodated twice their number. Patricia sat at one end, regal in a burgundy cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Hank occupied the opposite end, his presence filling the space despite his lean frame. Autumn sat to her mother's right, her fingers drumming silently on the polished wood surface. I took my seat beside Tanner, acutely aware of how my simple black dress contrasted with their effortless elegance. Patricia's eyes lingered on my outfit with the sort of attention that cataloged and dismissed in equal measure. Sage, she said, her voice cordial but distant. Tanner says you have something you'd like to share with us. I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope Claire had prepared. My hands were steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. I do. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my circumstances. I slid the document across the table to Patricia, who accepted it with the sort of careful precision as she might use to handle a snake. As her eyes scanned the first page, I watched her expression shift from polite interest to surprise to something approaching shock. This is... She began, then fell silent. Hank leaned forward. What is it, Patricia? She passed the statement to him without a word. I watched his weathered features change as he absorbed the numbers, his rancher's pragmatism warring with evident disbelief. How? Autumn asked, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. I explained about the investments, about the peculiar series of financial windfalls that had transformed my life. I kept my voice level, matter of fact, as if discussing the weather rather than the kind of wealth that redefined possibilities. The silence that followed stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then Patricia spoke, her voice different now, warmer but somehow more calculating. Well, she said, this does change things. The change in the McKinsey family's attitude was immediate and comprehensive. Within a week of my revelation, I found myself invited to Patricia's book club, included in family dinners, consulted on charitable endeavors. It was as if a switch had been flipped, transforming me from unwelcome outsider to valued family member. But the transformation wasn't limited to them. I began to notice changes in myself as well, subtle shifts in perspective that crept in like shadows at twilight. The first incident occurred at a fundraiser for the Jackson Hole Land Trust. I was standing with Tanner and his parents, discussing the evening's silent auction, when I overheard a comment from across the room. A woman I didn't recognize was speaking to her companion about the event's attendees. See that girl with the McKinseys? I heard she's some kind of gold digger. Probably after their ranch. 6 months earlier, such a comment would have devastated me. But now, with the security of my financial statement tucked away in my purse like a talisman, I felt only a cold amusement. I excused myself from the conversation and approached the two women. I'm sorry, I said, my voice carrying just enough ice to get their attention. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I think you may have me confused with someone else. I withdrew my phone and showed them a photo of my most recent investment summary. Their expression shifted from superiority to embarrassment to something approaching fear. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding, the first woman said, her voice higher than before. I'm sure it was, I replied, but I didn't smile. As I walked away, I felt a strange rush of power, a sensation I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I possessed something that commanded immediate respect, that could silence critics and open doors with equal efficiency. But with that power came a gradual erosion of something else, the empathy that had once been my defining characteristic, the ability to see myself and others' struggles. I found myself less patient with my former colleagues at the Snake River Lodge, less understanding of financial hardship, less willing to tolerate what I now saw as small-minded thinking. The second incident came a month later. I was having lunch with my old friend Jessica, who worked as a ski instructor at Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. She was telling me about her struggles to make rent, about the impossible economics of living in one of America's most expensive zip codes. "I don't know how much longer I can stay," she said, stirring her soup without eating it. "Even sharing a studio apartment, I'm barely breaking even." I found myself studying her with a detachment I didn't recognize. Her concerns seemed so petty, so easily solved. I could have written her a check that would eliminate her problems without even noticing the expense. But instead, I heard myself saying, "Have you considered that maybe Jackson isn't the right fit for you? Maybe you'd be happier somewhere more affordable?" Jessica looked at me as if I'd slapped her. "Sage, this is my home. I've lived here my whole life." "Sometimes we outgrow our homes," I replied, and the words felt foreign in my mouth, as if someone else were speaking through me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to me. The woman who had spoken to Jessica wasn't the same person who had cleaned houses alongside her mother, who had saved quarters in a jar to buy Christmas presents, who had once cried over a $20 overdraft fee. But then I would think about the McKinsey's acceptance, about the doors that had opened, about the security that surrounded me like armor, and I would push those concerns aside. Change was natural, I told myself. Growth required leaving some things behind. Spring arrived in Jackson with its usual dramatic flair, snowmelt rushing down from the high country while wildflowers pushed through the last patches of snow. Tanner and I began planning our wedding in earnest, and I discovered that my financial situation had fundamentally altered even this most personal of endeavors. Patricia had opinions about everything, from the venue to the guest list to the precise shade of ivory for my dress. But now her suggestions carried the weight of someone who saw me as an investment worth protecting rather than a threat to be neutralized. "We'll need to be careful about the guest list," she said during one of our planning sessions at the ranch. "There are certain expectations when two families of substance unite." Two families of substance. The phrase lodged in my mind like a splinter. When had I become substantial? When had my worth become measured in digits rather than character? But I found myself nodding along, even contributing suggestions that 6 months earlier would have horrified me. We should exclude certain people from the guest list, those whose presence might lower the tone of the event. We should ensure the wedding announcement appeared in the right publications, reached the right audiences. We should consider the long-term implications of every decision. The wedding was scheduled for September, at the height of the fall colors. We'd chosen the ranch as our venue, with the ceremony taking place in the meadow that overlooked the Teton Range. It would be beautiful, elegant, and exclusive, exactly the sort of event that would cement my position in Jackson's social hierarchy. But as the plans took shape, I began to feel a growing sense of disconnection from the celebration. The woman who had dreamed of a simple ceremony surrounded by friends and family was being steadily replaced by someone who thought in terms of strategic alliances and social positioning. The realization came to me one afternoon while I was at the florist with Autumn, selecting arrangements for the reception. The florist, a middle-aged woman named Beth who had been arranging flowers in Jackson for 20 years, was showing us options for the centerpieces. "These are beautiful," I said, indicating a simple arrangement of wildflowers and native grasses. "They remind me of the bouquets my mother used to pick when I was little." Autumn wrinkled her nose. "They're very rustic. Are you sure that's the impression you want to make?" I looked at the flowers again, seeing them through her eyes. Suddenly they seemed shabby, unsophisticated, the sort of thing that might embarrass us in front of our carefully curated guest list. "You're right," I said, and Beth's face fell slightly. "Let's go with the imported roses instead." As we left the shop, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. For just a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She looked polished, expensive, untouchable. But there was something missing from her eyes, some essential warmth that had been gradually leaching away. That night, I called my mother for the first time in weeks. She lived in a small apartment in town, continuing to clean houses despite my repeated offers to support her financially. Her independence was a point of pride, one I was beginning to find irritating rather than admirable. "How are the wedding plans coming along?" she asked, her voice warm with the excitement I no longer felt. "They're fine," I said, realizing I hadn't included her in most of the major decisions. "Patricia has been very helpful." "I'm sure she has." There was something in my mother's tone that made me defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, sweetheart. I hope you're still planning the wedding you want, not the wedding someone else thinks you should have." The comment stung because it carried a truth I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "I'm planning the wedding that makes sense for who I am now." "And who is that, exactly?" The question hung in the air between us, unanswered because I wasn't sure I knew the response anymore. The first crack in my carefully constructed new reality appeared in July, 3 months before the wedding. I was reviewing my investment portfolio with Claire when she brought something to my attention that made my blood run cold. "There's been some unusual activity in your biotech holdings," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I think we need to take a closer look at these companies." Over the next hour, she walked me through what she discovered. The pharmaceutical company whose stock had been the cornerstone of my wealth was under investigation by the FDA. Their revolutionary Alzheimer's treatment, the one that had sent their stock price soaring, was based on falsified clinical trial data. The cryptocurrency I'd invested in was the subject of a federal investigation into market manipulation. One by one, the investments that had transformed my life were revealing themselves to be built on foundations of sand and deception. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I could already see the answer in Claire's expression. "If the investigations conclude what they appear to be uncovering, you could lose everything. And depending on when you bought and sold, there might be legal implications." I sat in her office, staring at the papers spread across her desk, feeling my carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The wealth that had bought me acceptance, that had transformed me from outsider to insider, was evaporating like morning mist. But the most terrifying realization wasn't financial, it was personal. Without the armor of wealth, who was I? The old Sage, the one who had possessed empathy and genuine warmth, felt like a stranger. The new Sage, polished and strategic, was entirely dependent on resources that were disappearing by the hour. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with the implications. The wedding was 2 months away. Deposits had been made, invitations sent, expectations established. The McKinsey family had accepted me based on financial statements that would soon be worthless paper. More than that, I had accepted myself based on those same numbers. I had allowed wealth to redefine not just my circumstances, but my character, my values, my very sense of identity. That evening, Tanner came over with takeout from our favorite restaurant, chattering about final wedding preparations. I watched him spread containers across my dining table, this man I loved, but who had fallen in love with a version of me that was rapidly ceasing to exist. "My mother wants to know if you've decided on the wine selection," he said, not looking up from the containers. "She's worried about having enough of the good stuff for the important guests." The important guests. The phrase echoed in my mind, carrying with it all the implications of our stratified social world. Who decided which guests were important? What made someone worthy of the good wine versus the adequate wine? "Tanner," I said, and something in my voice made him look up. What if things were different? What if I wasn't? What if my circumstances changed? He paused, a container of Thai curry halfway to the table. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the money went away? What if I went back to being the girl who served you dinner at the Snake River Lodge?" His laugh was uncomfortable. "That's not going to happen, Sage. You're good with investments. You've proven that." But I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested he'd never seriously considered the possibility. Why would he? From his perspective, money was as permanent as the mountains that surrounded us, as immutable as the social order that governed our lives. But what if it did? I pressed. "Would you still want to marry me?" "Of course," he said, but the answer came too quickly, sounded too rehearsed. "I fell in love with you, not your bank account." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But I could see the doubt creeping into his expression, the recognition that he'd never been tested in the way I was asking him to consider. "Did you?" I asked quietly. "Fall in love with me, I mean. Or did you fall in love with the idea of me?" The question hung between us like a challenge neither of us was prepared to answer. The next morning brought news that confirmed my worst fears. The biotech company's stock had been halted pending the FDA investigation. The cryptocurrency exchange had frozen all accounts while federal authorities seized records. My net worth, which had reached nearly $15 million at its peak, was now effectively zero. But the financial collapse was only the beginning. By afternoon, I received a call from a federal agent named David Sterling who wanted to discuss my investment activities. His voice was polite but implacable, the tone of someone accustomed to unraveling complex financial crimes. Ms. Whitmore, we're conducting an investigation into possible securities fraud involving several companies in your portfolio. We'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about your trading history. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the detritus of my transformed life, designer clothes, expensive art, furniture that cost more than I used to make in a year, and felt the full weight of what was happening. I wasn't just losing my money, I was potentially facing criminal charges for the crime of being too successful too quickly. The irony wasn't lost on me. The wealth that had elevated me to the McKinsey family's social stratum had been built on fraud and manipulation. I had unknowingly become complicit in schemes that had enriched me while destroying others. The money that had bought me acceptance was dirty money, tainted by crimes I hadn't even known I was committing. But perhaps the most disturbing realization was how little I had questioned my good fortune. When the returns on my investments seemed too good to be true, I had chosen to believe in my own luck rather than investigate the underlying reality. I had wanted the transformation so badly that I had willingly blinded myself to the signs that it was built on lies. Agent Sterling arrived at my apartment that evening, accompanied by a woman who introduced herself as Federal Prosecutor Rebecca Hayes. They were professional, courteous, and utterly relentless in their pursuit of the truth. We're not suggesting you knowingly participated in any fraudulent activity, Hayes explained as they sat across from me at my dining table. But we need to understand how someone with your limited investment experience could have achieved such extraordinary returns in such a short period. I told them everything I could remember, the research I'd done, the hunches I'd followed, the advice I'd received. But as I spoke, I could hear how implausible it all sounded. A cocktail waitress who had somehow stumbled onto the investment opportunities that had eluded sophisticated financial professionals? A woman who had turned tip money into millions through a series of lucky guesses? Ms. Whitmore, Sterling said, his voice gentle but insistent, did anyone approach you with investment advice? Did anyone suggest specific stocks or cryptocurrency investments? I tried to remember, but the early days of my financial transformation felt like a dream now, distant and unreal. There had been conversations at the lodge, customers who'd mentioned hot stocks or new cryptocurrency opportunities. But I couldn't recall specifics, couldn't connect any particular person to any particular investment. I don't think so, I said, but uncertainty crept into my voice. The agents exchanged glances, and I realized that my inability to explain my success was itself suspicious. Innocent investors could usually trace their decisions back to specific research or advice. Conspirators, on the other hand, often claimed to remember nothing about how they'd become involved in fraudulent schemes. After they left, I sat alone in my apartment as darkness fell over Jackson. The lights of the town spread out below my window, each one representing a life, a story, a person who had never experienced the dizzying rise and catastrophic fall that defined my last 18 months. For the first time since the investigation began, I allowed myself to truly contemplate what I had lost. Not just the money, though that was staggering enough, but the person I had been before wealth had transformed me, the capacity for genuine connection and empathy that had been gradually eroded by financial success. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't sure I liked. And now, as that constructed identity crumbled around me, I was left to confront the question of who I really was beneath the designer clothes and investment statements. I didn't tell Tanner about the investigation immediately. Some part of me still hoped that the agents would discover their mistake, that my investments would be vindicated, that my new life would survive intact. But 3 days later, when the story broke in the Jackson Hole News and Guide, secrecy was no longer an option. The headline was devastating in its simplicity. Local woman under investigation in securities fraud case. The article didn't mention my name directly, but anyone who knew me would recognize the details. The timing of the investigation, just 2 months before my wedding to the McKinsey heir, ensured maximum social impact. Tanner arrived at my apartment within an hour of the story's publication, his face a mask of controlled fury. He didn't knock. He used the key I'd given him 6 months earlier, when our relationship had seemed like the beginning of a fairy tale rather than the end of a nightmare. Is it true? He asked without preamble. I was sitting on my couch, still in the same clothes I'd worn the day before, staring at my laptop screen where the news article glowed with accusatory light. I looked up at him. This man I'd planned to marry, who represented everything I'd thought I wanted, and felt a strange sense of relief. Yes, I said simply. His face crumpled, not with sadness, but with what looked like betrayal. How could you not tell me? How could you let me find out like this? Because I hoped it would go away, I said, and even to my own ears, the words sounded pathetic. Because I hoped it was all a mistake. He paced across my small living room, his agitation filling the space. My family is asking questions, Sage. They want to know if I knew, if I was involved somehow. Do you understand what this could do to our reputation? Our reputation, not our relationship, not our future together, but the carefully constructed image that had defined our courtship. I realized that I had never seen him so clearly. This man who had fallen in love with my financial statement rather than my character. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it, though perhaps not in the way he expected. Sorry doesn't fix this. He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. My mother wants to postpone the wedding. She thinks we should wait until this whole thing blows over. And what do you want? I asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing his love for me against the social cost of standing by me, measuring his feelings against the expectations of his family and community. I want to marry you, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. But I need to understand what we're dealing with first. I need to know how bad this is going to get. I told him everything then, about the investigation, about the potential charges, about the complete collapse of my financial position. I watched his expression change as the magnitude of the situation became clear, saw the exact moment when he realized that the woman he'd proposed to no longer existed. So the money is gone, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. All of it. Essentially, yes. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, his head in his hands. My God, Sage, what are we supposed to do now? Though we felt hollow, performative, as if he were trying to convince himself that our partnership could survive this revelation. But I could see the truth in his posture, in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Maybe your mother is right, I said quietly. Maybe we should postpone the wedding. He looked up sharply. Is that what you want? What I wanted was to go back 18 months, to be the woman who had been content with her small apartment and honest work, who had possessed genuine warmth instead of calculated charm. What I wanted was to never have tasted the kind of wealth that corrupted everything it touched, including the person I had once been. But those weren't options available to me. So instead, I said, I want you to be happy. I want you to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and know you made the right choice. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of unspoken truths settling between us. Finally, he stood up and walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back. I do love you, he said. I need you to know that. I know, I replied, though I wondered if either of us was entirely sure what that meant anymore. After he left, I remained on the couch, staring out at the mountains that had watched over Jackson for millennia. They were unchanging, eternal, indifferent to the small human dramas that played out in their shadow. I envied them their permanence, their immunity to the corrupting influence of money and social ambition. The wedding was officially postponed 3 days later. Patricia McKenzie called personally to deliver the news, her voice carrying the sort of cold politeness reserved for people who had outlived their usefulness. Given the circumstances, she said, we feel it would be best to wait until your legal situation is resolved. I'm sure you understand. I did understand. I understood that my value to the McKenzie family had been entirely contingent on my financial worth, that their acceptance of me had been a transaction rather than genuine affection. I understood that I had been playing a game whose rules I had never fully grasped, and that I had lost the moment my net worth began to decline. But perhaps most importantly, I understood that I had allowed myself to become complicit in my own dehumanization. I had traded my authentic self for social acceptance, had sacrificed genuine relationships for strategic alliances. I had become everything I had once found distasteful about Jackson's social elite, and I had done it willingly, eagerly, convinced that the benefits outweighed the costs. The investigation intensified over the following weeks. My phone was tapped, my bank records scrutinized, my every financial decision subjected to forensic analysis. Agent Sterling and Prosecutor Hayes became regular fixtures in my life, their questions growing more pointed as the evidence mounted. The picture that emerged was devastating in its implications. I hadn't been a random victim of investment fraud. I had been specifically targeted by a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in laundering money through unsuspecting intermediaries. My sudden wealth hadn't been the result of luck or skill. It had been the byproduct of a carefully orchestrated scheme to legitimize the proceeds of various criminal enterprises. They chose you because you were perfect, Hayes explained during one of our sessions. Young, naive, desperate to improve your circumstances. Someone who would be grateful for success and wouldn't ask too many questions. The revelation was crushing. Every investment I'd made, every dollar I'd earned, every moment of pride I'd felt about my financial acumen, all of it had been orchestrated by criminals who had used me as an unwitting accomplice in their schemes. But the legal implications were only part of the damage. The social consequences were immediate and total. Invitations were rescinded, friends became strangers, former allies crossed the street to avoid acknowledging my presence. Jackson's tight-knit community had a long memory for scandal, and I had become a pariah overnight. I lost my apartment, unable to make rent without access to my frozen assets. I moved back in with my mother, occupying the same small bedroom I'd lived in as a teenager, surrounded by the possessions of a simpler time. The designer clothes hung in the closet like costumes from a play I was no longer performing, their expensive fabrics a mocking reminder of the person I had briefly believed myself to be. My mother, to her credit, asked no questions and offered no judgment. She simply made space for me in her life, the way she had always done, with the quiet generosity that had sustained us through years of financial hardship. "You're still my daughter," she said one evening as we sat in her small kitchen, sharing a dinner of soup and sandwiches. "Everything else is just noise." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not because they were unexpected, but because they reminded me of what I had lost in my pursuit of acceptance. I had gained a fortune and lost myself, traded authentic love for conditional approval, sacrificed the relationships that mattered most for the validation of people who had never really known me. The trial began in February, almost a year after the investigation had started. By then, the full scope of the criminal enterprise had been revealed. Dozens of people across multiple states had been used as unwitting money launderers, their investment accounts serving as waypoints for millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. I was offered a plea deal cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The terms were straightforward. Testify against the people who had orchestrated the scheme, help the government understand how the money laundering network had operated, accept responsibility for my role as an unknowing participant. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, less dramatic than the legal proceedings depicted on television. But the weight of what was happening there was profound. Lies were being dissected, reputations destroyed, futures decided by the testimony of people who had been as deceived as anyone. When I took the stand, I saw familiar faces in the gallery. Tanner was there, sitting with his family, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and distaste. Former friends, colleagues, people who had known me before and after my transformation. They had come to witness the final chapter of my fall from grace, to see how the story would end. Prosecutor Hayes walked me through my testimony with careful precision. How I had been recruited, the conversations that had led to my initial investments, the gradual escalation that had resulted in my unwitting participation in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. "Did you know that your investment returns were the result of criminal activity?" she asked. "No," I replied, my voice steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes upon me. I believed I had been lucky. Looking back, were there signs that should have alerted you to the fraudulent nature of these investments? I paused, considering the question carefully. Yes. The returns were too good, too consistent. I should have been more skeptical. Why weren't you? The question hung in the air, demanding a level of honesty that cut to the bone. Because I wanted it to be true, I said finally. Because I wanted to believe that I could transform my life, that I could become someone different. The money gave me access to a world I had always been excluded from, and I didn't want to examine it too closely for fear that it would disappear. The admission felt like confession, like the first honest thing I had said in months. In the gallery, I saw my mother's face, her expression one of understanding rather than judgment. She had watched my transformation with growing concern, had seen me lose pieces of myself in pursuit of social acceptance. But it was Tanner's reaction that surprised me most. He was leaning forward slightly, his attention completely focused on my testimony, and for the first time since the scandal had broken, I saw something in his eyes that looked like the man I had fallen in love with rather than the heir to a ranching dynasty. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Caroline Rush, attacked every aspect of my testimony, suggesting that I had been more complicit than I claimed, that my financial sophistication was greater than I admitted. Isn't it true, Ms. Whitmore, that you researched these investments extensively before committing your money? I did some research, yes. And isn't it true that this research would have revealed irregularities in the company's financial statements? I don't know. I'm not trained to read financial statements at that level of detail. But you're asking this jury to believe that you invested millions of dollars without understanding what you were investing in? The question was designed to make me look either criminally naive or deliberately deceptive. But as I considered my answer, I realized that both options contained elements of truth. I had been naive, willfully so, but I had also been guilty of a kind of moral laziness that had allowed me to ignore warning signs I should have heeded. I'm asking the jury to understand that desperation can make people make choices they wouldn't otherwise make, I said. That the desire to belong, to be accepted, can blind us to truths we don't want to see. Rush pressed me for another hour, but I had found my footing. I answered her questions honestly, admitting my mistakes while maintaining that I had never knowingly participated in criminal activity. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had finally told the complete truth about what had happened to me. The trial concluded in March, with convictions for the ringleaders and immunity for most of the unwitting participants like myself. But my legal vindication did little to repair the social and personal damage that had been done. Jackson's memory for scandal was long, and my association with the case had permanently altered my place in the community. I was working at a small diner on the outskirts of town, serving coffee and pie to truckers and tourists, when the final twist in my story revealed itself. It was a rainy April morning, the kind of gray day that made the mountains disappear behind walls of cloud, when Agent Sterling walked through the diner's front door. He slid into a booth in my section and ordered coffee, black, his expression unreadable. After I brought his cup, he gestured for me to sit down across from him. "There's something we need to discuss," he said without preamble. I felt my stomach drop. Am I in trouble again? No, nothing like that. But we've uncovered some additional information about your case. Information that changes our understanding of what happened to you. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder, placing it on the table between us. Inside were photographs, documents, surveillance reports, the detritus of an investigation that had apparently continued long after the trial had ended. "Do you remember a customer at the Snake River Lodge named Marcus Webb?" Sterling asked. I searched my memory. The name was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place a face with it. Maybe. We had a lot of regular customers. Sterling slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man in his 50s, well-dressed, with the sort of forgettable features that would make him invisible in a crowd. As I stared at the image, fragments of memory began to surface. "He used to sit at table 12, I said slowly. "Always ordered the salmon. Always tipped exactly 20%. He asked a lot of questions about my life, about my goals." "What kind of questions?" "Whether I was happy with my job, whether I had any plans to invest my tips, whether I'd ever thought about cryptocurrency." The implications of what Sterling was suggesting began to dawn on me. He was targeting me specifically, wasn't he? Sterling nodded grimly. "Marcus Webb is actually Martin Sinclair, one of the most sophisticated financial criminals we've ever encountered. He specializes in identifying and recruiting money launderers, people who can be manipulated into participating in schemes without realizing what they're doing." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation I'd had with this man, every piece of investment advice he'd casually offered, every moment I'd thought I was demonstrating financial acumen, all of it had been orchestrated manipulation. "He studied you for months," Sterling continued. "Your background, your personality, your vulnerabilities. He knew exactly what buttons to push to make you susceptible to his suggestions." I stared at the photograph, remembering the man's friendly demeanor, his apparent interest in my welfare. He had seemed like a benevolent mentor, someone who genuinely wanted to help me improve my circumstances. The thought that his kindness had been calculated manipulation made me feel physically ill. "But why me?" I asked. "Why was I worth all that effort?" "Because you were perfect," Sterling replied, echoing Prosecutor Hayes's earlier assessment. "Young, ambitious, isolated from your community by economic circumstances. Someone who would be grateful for success and wouldn't ask inconvenient questions." someone whose sudden wealth would seem plausible to outside observers. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My transformation hadn't been the result of luck or skill or even random victimization. It had been a carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation designed to turn me into an unwitting accomplice in a criminal enterprise. But more than that, it had been an assault on my very identity. Sinclair hadn't just used my money. He had used my desires, my insecurities, my deepest vulnerabilities against me. He had taken a lonely young woman's dream of acceptance and turned it into a weapon of self-destruction. "We're going to need you to testify again," Sterling said. "Sinclair's trial is next month, and your testimony will be crucial to establishing his methods." I nodded, though the prospect of reliving the whole experience filled me with dread. "Will it help the other victims?" "It might. If we can establish the pattern, we might be able to recover some of the stolen money, help people rebuild their lives." After Sterling left, I sat in the empty diner, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot. The revelation about Sinclair's manipulation should have made me feel better, should have absolved me of some of the guilt I'd carried about my choices. Instead, it made me feel hollow, used, diminished in ways I was still trying to understand. Tanner found me that evening, sitting on the small porch of my mother's house, watching the sun set behind the storm clouds. He looked different, older somehow, more thoughtful, less certain of his place in the world. "I heard about Sinclair," he said, settling into the chair beside me without invitation. "News travels fast in Jackson. Sage, I owe you an apology." Several apologies, actually. I turned to look at him, this man I had once planned to marry, who represented a life I had briefly believed was within my reach. "For what?" "For not standing by you when the scandal broke. For letting my family's concerns override my feelings for you. For making you feel like your worth was tied to your bank account." His words were generous, but they came too late to repair the damage that had been done. Too much had changed, too much had been revealed about both of us for us to simply return to what we had been. "I don't blame you," I said, and I meant it. "I lost myself in that money, Tanner. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone I'm not sure I liked very much. If I couldn't remain true to myself, how could I expect you to remain true to someone who no longer existed?" We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of Jackson flicker to life in the gathering darkness. Finally, he spoke again. "My family's business is in trouble," he said. "Has been for years, actually. The ranch is heavily mortgaged. The cattle operation is barely breaking even. We've been keeping up appearances, but the truth is we're one bad season away from bankruptcy." The admission surprised me. The Mackenzies had always seemed like the epitome of old money stability, their wealth as permanent as the mountains that surrounded their land. "I'm sorry," I said, and I was. "The irony is that when you showed us your bank statement, I thought our problems were solved. I thought you were our salvation, financially speaking. It never occurred to me that you might need saving too. We were both looking for something the other couldn't provide," I said. "You wanted financial security, I wanted social acceptance. Neither of us was seeing the other person clearly. Maybe that's true, but I did love you, Sage. I still do in some ways. Just not in the way you deserve to be loved." His honesty was painful but necessary. It confirmed what I had suspected during our final confrontation, that our relationship had been built on mutual need rather than genuine understanding, on what we represented to each other rather than who we actually were. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know. Try to save the ranch, probably. Maybe sell off some of the land for development. My mother hates the idea, but we may not have a choice. And personally," he was quiet for a long moment, "learn to be alone, I think. Figure out who I am when I'm not trying to live up to anyone else's expectations." It was a goal I understood intimately. 2 years have passed since the trials ended, since the last of the criminal organization was brought to justice, since my brief transformation from waitress to millionaire to cautionary tale concluded. I still live in Jackson, though my place in the community has been forever altered by the events that briefly made me wealthy and ultimately revealed how little I understood about the cost of belonging. I work at the same diner where Agent Sterling found me, serving coffee and listening to the stories of people passing through town. It's honest work, the kind that allows me to sleep at night without wondering whose money I'm spending or what crimes might have funded my lifestyle. My tips go into a savings account at the local bank, where they earn modest interest and grow slowly, transparently, legitimately. The investigation and trials recovered some of the stolen money, though far less than was taken. Dozens of victims across the country received partial restitution, enough to help them rebuild their lives, but not enough to restore what they had lost. I received nothing, having been classified as a conduit rather than a victim, but I found I didn't resent the decision. Justice is rarely perfect, rarely complete, but it's preferable to the alternative. My mother and I have grown closer, bonded by adversity and the recognition that wealth, real wealth, lies in relationships that survive hardship rather than accounts that accumulate interest. She still cleans houses, though I've convinced her to reduce her client load and let me help with expenses. It's a compromise that preserves her independence while acknowledging our mutual interdependence. Tanner and I see each other occasionally, usually at community events or in the grocery store, where we exchange polite pleasantries and careful updates about our lives. He's managed to save the family ranch by selling development rights to a conservation trust, a solution that preserved the land while providing the capital needed to pay down their debts. He's dating someone new, a teacher from the local elementary school whose worth isn't measured in financial statements. The McKinsey family treats me with distant courtesy when our paths cross, the sort of politeness reserved for people who know uncomfortable truths about each other. Patricia still hosts her charity events and book clubs, still maintains the social hierarchies that govern Jackson's elite circles, but I suspect my story has made her more cautious about accepting newcomers based solely on financial credentials. But perhaps the most important change has been in my relationship with myself. The woman who was briefly wealthy, who tasted the intoxicating power of financial success, no longer exists. In her place is someone more cautious but also more genuine, someone who understands that identity cannot be purchased, that acceptance based on bank statements is not acceptance at all. I've learned to recognize the signs of manipulation, both external and internal. When someone seems too interested in my personal finances, when opportunities appear too good to be true, when my ego whispers that I deserve more than I have, I remember Marcus Webb's friendly questions and calculated kindness. I remember how easy it was to lose myself in the promise of transformation, how readily I sacrificed authenticity for acceptance. The story I've told you is not unique. Across the country, thousands of people are targeted every year by sophisticated criminals who understand that loneliness, desperation, and the desire for a better life make us vulnerable to manipulation. They prey on our dreams, weaponize our insecurities, turn our hopes against us with surgical precision. But their success depends on our silence, on our shame about being deceived, on our reluctance to admit that we were not as smart or as careful as we believed ourselves to be. They count on us to blame ourselves rather than recognize that we were victims of crimes that have nothing to do with our intelligence or character.